Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today we're flying by the seat of our pants. Didn't know what we were going to talk about, and then I think it was Matt who mentioned the word post-ideological, and I was about to do a rant on that word specifically, and he thought he could connect my rant into a broader conversation about relating to knowledge and how much the nature of ideology and how much an ideology can curate things in the real world. Um, and this also connects to, we did an episode a while back on political ideologies. We also did an episode a while back on like power and its connection to morality with our friend Kohei. So you can watch those episodes for like similar rabbit holes we're going to go down. But just to jump right into it. The reason the word post-ideological ticks me off is because when I hear it, when I hear people talk about it, well, they're really talking about it in two ways, and only one way is like annoying to me. If by post-ideological you're using the term in the way that like academics are using it, which just means a worldview, a way of thinking about things, then you could say we live in a post-ideological age because there are ideological battles that are really just dead and buried, and they're in the past. And the way people think about ideology now and ideas and worldviews is fundamentally different from the way people used to think about it. So in that sense, you could use the phrase. But what I think people mean often when they use that phrase is, I'm objective, I'm intelligent, I see through all the BS because I'm post-ideological or I'm non-ideological. Not exactly the same thing, but similar concepts. I have moved past the confines of this worldview or that worldview, and I have raised myself up to something greater. But this is why I like Slavoj Žižek so much, because Slavoj's point is everything is ideology, even post-ideology. Even the people that are arguing that like most of the ideological battles have been solved and this kind of neoliberal, technocratic global order is kind of just the way it's going to be from now on. Maybe add some, Fukuyamaist liberal democracy in there as well. If what we have right now is just the solution to social ills, and that is sort of like an attitude that I think a lot of people have, particularly those in power. But what that tells me, though, is those in power and the people that are supporting those in power are wanting to put an end to certain conversations. They're wanting to sweep a lot of things under the rug. They're wanting to they don't want you to critically analyze what they're saying, and they don't want you to critically analyze the political consensus nowadays because we're post-ideological. We don't have to do it anymore. But I think everything's ideological because human beings are. Well, I hate to agree with my mortal enemy, Jordan Peterson, but he says somewhere that, all we have is stories. And I think he's fundamentally right about that, actually. Pretty much everything in human life, the kind of friends you have, the job you have, the school you go to, your background, your religion, whatever, your politics. It's all about, the narratives that are, come from yourself, the narratives that you tell yourself, the narratives you construct, the narratives other people construct around you, the narratives that your culture inculcates in you. And you could even say that intellectual pursuits are also based on narratives. So that is a truth that to me is a truth about the human condition. You can't get away from stories. And I think stories, they always have a point of view. They're always pushing something. They're always trying to get you to think about something or get you to agree with something. Some stories are more, dogmatic or moralistic. Others are more Socratic. But there's never really a passive observer, so to speak. You never really get a bird's eye view of the situation. You're always getting some slant of the situation. So that's an opening burst. But I think that is a good place to start this conversation.
Yeah, and I think I agree with a lot of what you kind of laid out there. Like, a person calling another person ideological has essentially been a slur in political discourse for a while now, at least for as long as I've engaged in politics. And I used to be a contrarian to some degree and double down on being ideological in the sense of I thought my ideology is well-founded, and I think the moral claims I make are the most true. And if that makes me ideological and defending my moral claims makes me an ideological person, all I want to do is defend my moral claims. So I triple down on it. I think the reason why I was leaning into the idea of wanting to talk about what I would perceive as post-ideological is to put another slant on the conversation. And to some degree, framing everything as ideological is something I'm accepting of, but it's almost like I'm trying to engage with it more honestly than a lot of the actors do. And it's almost like a lot of ideologies have certain presuppositions. In a way, those presuppositions are actually the conclusions of certain ideological worldviews. So like you mentioned Fukuyama, and we kind of talked about Fukuyama a little bit earlier, and we almost did an episode on that. We might in the future. But a kind of a vague summary of Fukuyama is something like world governments will converge into some sort of liberal democracy. And that's like the inevitable future. In a way, that's like a presupposition and a conclusion from Fukuyama. What I'm trying to get at, and why I kind of pitched this idea, is I want to talk about the things that are almost not natural laws in the rhetorical sense, but there are certain things that manifest themselves no matter what. So Fukuyama, his whole argument and his whole worldview is trying to say the world converging on liberal democracy is where it's going. And it's not just because he hopes that's where it's going. He's kind of saying, and it's not even that necessarily that he might be saying that's the moral direction. He's more saying that is what's happening. Now, the reason why you and I would critique that is we don't really necessarily think that has legs or has been proven in the same honest way that I kind of want to put forward, I guess, other basic things that need to be considered. Because I don't disagree with labeling that as an ideology. It's almost like when people talk about ideology, a lot of times they're talking about their moral intuitions and then how they can paste that onto a society. And that's really what my goal is to avoid in this conversation. I don't want it to be a reckoning of how to paste my worldview onto the world around me. I want it to be like an acknowledgement of, in spite of any of our moral intuitions, what are things we know that will happen? And is there something to be said about focusing on those things instead of our moral intuitions? So, does that make sense?
Well, this reminds me of sort of Peter Turgeon's work and cryodynamics. I think that's what it is. And social statics, I think, is another work he wrote. And we're obviously not going to talk about that. That's a mountain, and we'll probably have Keegan on or someone to talk about that at a later date. But that's where my mind goes, because there's been this question really for a long time about history, and can you predict, how predictive should history be, or even how scientific should history be? How objective can you understand? How objective can you be when you're studying history? And are there historical laws? Can you kind of map out the rise and fall of civilizations? Can you map out the economy and the way various policies, the pros and cons, or the causes and effects? What about political systems? Can you map out how those work? And I hope I'm not repeating myself. I know I've said this off air, and if I've said this on air, I apologize. But that is something I'm very interested in, and something I want to study more. But I worry that we are, it is beyond our current, capacities to predict, to understand history as a series of historical laws. I think it probably is a series of historical laws. I do believe that everything is deterministic, and even things that seem totally random probably are deterministic. So in that sense, I think history has been, every actor within history and every event that happened, it was a series of causes and effects that in theory you should be able to map out onto in theory you should be able to map out and create a predictive models of human behavior and human society. But at least at this moment in time, we're far off from that.
Yeah. So I think that touches on, surprisingly, I think there are two things to suss out from that. So like the idea of a historical law or historical laws that can be drawn from history is something that I'm interested in, but I think that carries a connotation and an expectation that is not what I'm actually hoping to set forward. And this is why I'm actually like I've started to dive into Peter Turchin's work, but I'm going in incredibly skeptical. And the main reason why is because grand theories that try to take into account like several parameters to almost like empiricize societies is something that I'm very, very skeptical of. Now, what I think is possible is I think there might be elements of certain events or elements of certain policies that get put forward that break rules that we know exist or try to circumvent rules that we know exist. And maybe a lot of this comes from my unwillingness to work with people who I find partially misleading, but it's kind of like this idea that if a politician puts forward an idea and they tell us what the policy is and what the goal is, I think there might be very obvious signals that those policies will not achieve that goal. And it might not be because we have this grand equation that takes into account a lot of things after historical analysis, but there just might be certain rules that when we look into it, we find hold true. Or if we like do a case study on a policy, we would find that it violates certain functions. So an example of this would be somebody who intrigues me in the context of Turchin, which is why I'm trying to get into Turchin, is Taleb, who I talk about a lot. And he wrote the book Anti-Fragile, right? So this is all about systems that survive. It's not just that they survive stressors, which is what I think confuses people a lot. It's things that actually gain from having stress put on them. So it's not like a house of cards where you put it in a place where you don't expect it to get nudged, and then when it does, it completely collapses, so you're screwed. It's like, no, you want something that actually strengthens under pressure. And there are elements that maybe we could distill in the, if somebody put the effort into. I mean, Taleb has a book about it, so I'm sure he could distill plenty of these in a summary if he wanted to. But there are elements of structures that show that they could actually benefit from stressors. Or we could just look at, say, we could look at a list of businesses in like an industry, and we could look at ones that survived, say, the 2008 financial crisis, right? And then we could say, why did these ones survive and why did these ones fail, right? And then you can look at, here's why these types of businesses in this industry were anti-fragile. And then instead of, doing things like artificially keeping them in business, we can say, we now understand that certain precautions make businesses in certain sectors less likely to completely break down under stress. And then that's something that can be replicated, right? So like this type of action would do a lot more for society than, say, stimulus, because you're trying to distill an element of something that is good. And we know it is good because it is proven to be good in the system, and then expand on it. So like this is beyond moral claims, right? This is beyond claims of, I want this, I want that, the world would be a nicer place if, because I feel like this is just. It's like, here's how things break down in real life. we need to look to replicate this as much as possible so things don't break down. And we know that certain things survive and certain things fail. Why? But it doesn't have to be societal. That's what I think I want to pull away from, maybe.
I'm afraid I'm gonna have to make this conversation more abstract because you're talking about things that are just outside my areas of expertise. But I actually think I agree with you. Because I do think we need to be more. We do need to go beyond values if we're going to propose policies, economic or otherwise. We need to go beyond. Oh, this is nice. I like this. I desire this. Therefore, we'll go with that. Now, unfortunately, I don't really think that's like economic and political policy. I'm not even sure it often goes beyond the moral, or if it goes beyond the I like this, let's pursue that, or I don't like this, let's go to war with those people because I don't like them or whatever. I think it's whether we're talking about kings or oligarchs or politicians or what have you. I think many of them, I mean, that they have to operate within the real world, so they have to have a certain knowledge of what's going on. And people in the U.S. government say, whether you think they're, even if you think they're evil, horrible monsters, they at least know something about the something about how government works, something about how the economy works. But at the same time, I think a lot of policies don't come out of, well, let's kind of try to see if we can get this policy to work like a clock, or if we can get this. Well, you say you don't want to, or it doesn't have to be broadened out to society. But I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think policy is like people think about policy as we want society to be a well-run machine. That people might I think talk about it that way, but I don't think that's really how policy gets created or implemented. It's not necessarily for efficiency's sake. It has to do with other more non-empirical things, or other more abstract or philosophical things, which aren't necessarily like justifiable or empirically sound. And I'm not saying, by the way, just to be clear, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm trying to make a point of how I think people behave. I'm not saying that's how they should behave.
Yeah, so I think I agree with that. There's like a few applications of I think what I'm trying to point out. So I guess an example would be you and I. It's like statistically true that not everybody is like of equal intellectual capacity, right? So if the broad goal of some sort of policy was we want everybody to succeed to this equal degree, we know that's not really possible on the table just based on how like variance between humans work. So if it's like I don't want to get I don't know all the details of George W. Bush's like Common Core and No Child Left Behind type acts, but it's like there will always be a segment of people that fall like well below average intelligence. So any policy that seeks to minimize that, maybe there are certain targeted policies that could minimize that. But we know that there's like a level of equality that could never be reached just based on like inevitable variance. So I'm not saying that there should be no strides to make to equal out the lowest of the lows and maybe the highest of the highs. That's not the point. It's just it needs to be reckoned with that there are certain things inalienable to the human condition, because you'll never have a society of 200 people that all have exactly the same IQ unless you sorted that out and then put them all in the same room on purpose, right? You're not going to have 200 random people in a county in a middle state that are all equal capacity. It won't happen. So trying to like educate kids with the goal that they all get there is like ignorant of the circumstances we're working with. So it's like, this is the real world that we have to function in. We have to be weary of policies that seek to circumvent that, because this is an inevitability, and that's okay. That's like application one, I guess.
Well, I think this connects to like the last episode we did on the technocratic revolution, or the fact that we've kind of we collectively have kind of given this power to the technocrats, maybe unwillingly or unbeknownst to us, but the so if you think about like public school, the public school system, the public school system is it is a way to try to make society work effectively like a clock. It is designed to give everybody a certain amount of education. Hopefully that will lead them to a certain amount of skills in certain areas, whether they become a college professor or an electrician or a physicist. The hope is that everyone's going to be. It doesn't even have to be like some grand moral claim about like, oh, everyone's going to be educated and therefore everyone's life's going to be better. It's about like, how can we fit all the puzzle pieces together into a cohesive whole? How can we get people to how do we get as many people as possible to be a productive member of society? And what do we do with the remainder that for whatever reason are unable or unwilling to be productive members? It's a top-down approach to human relations, and I think it is ultimately an untenable one, the top-down approach. Yeah, I'll stick with that statement. But this is sort of why. I mean, you don't. I'm gonna make. I'll throw this other statement out there. You don't have to we don't have to go down this rabbit hole. But this is why when we have our arguments against or about the state, this is why I'll find myself not even. I mean, sometimes I don't even feel like I'm supporting the state, but I'm just saying, I don't feel like we're ever going to go past the state. I feel like any stateless societies will end up being overtaken by state, by a state. In the same way that smaller groups or smaller communities often end up getting, absorbed by a larger community. I sort of think even though I just said I'm suspicious of the top-down approach to I guess implementing policy. At the same time, I think a rule that in human history is there are people below and people above. There are rulers and there are ruled. There are people who give orders. There are people who take orders. There are people with more or less power, more or less influence, more or less. Or some people have the ability to coerce others for whatever reason. I see this as something we just can't get away from. But we have to. I still want to make life more pleasant, even if there are aspects of the human condition which we can't overcome, which there certainly are. The reason I bring up Freud so much to people is not because, I'm just trying to be a contrarian, but is because psychoanalysis starts from the perspective of you are an irrational being, and there are just things about you that are kind of inexplicable or difficult to comprehend, and there's a pain and suffering attached to that, and so that's why you have to try to better understand yourself, so you can regulate, the uncertainty in your behavior and in your character.
So that was actually a very smooth transition into the next element of why I think post-ideological conversation is important. And I think I can build off that well, although I'm not going to dig into Freud or anything. So I think I've joked about this with you before. I've joked about it with certain people before. There's a think tank in DC that's libertarian oriented called the Cato Institute. And a lot of people really hate on the Cato Institute because they do what a lot of think tanks do. They write a bunch of papers that nobody reads. I think the Cato Institute's policies would work better for society, but there's a reason why they're not implemented. And this is kind of going to the point that you're making about like, hey, small communities, I think they get eaten up by state communities that are larger for a reason. Things like that, things of that sort. So there is a political reality that has to be acknowledged, and that political reality is separate from whatever my moral intuitions about the validity of government are. It persists, it exists, and there are reasons. So when the Cato Institute talks about the Jones Act, which is essentially a policy that says, hey, if you want to do domestic shipping in the United States via boat, it has to have a boat made in America, something like that. I'm pretty sure that's a good summary of it. That makes shipping costs to Puerto Rico and Hawaii really expensive. So Puerto Rico and Hawaii actually import goods from foreign countries because having a ship that was made in the U.S. and has crew from the U.S. is way more expensive than international travel. So Cato Institute does this all the time. They talk about the Jones Act so much, right? And I know that I just put you to sleep talking to you about the Jones Act for 40 seconds. And that's kind of a testament to the point I'm making. Nobody cares about the Jones Act. And it's like, why? Well, it affects certain people on the margins. And frankly, the lobbying efforts don't really do anything because there are probably interests at play that want the Jones Act to stay intact. Probably shipbuilders in the United States and crews in the United States that might be unionized, something like that. So there are interests that keep the Jones Act to exist no matter how many white papers the Cato Institute writes. The thing that I draw from this isn't that the Cato Institute's wrong. It's just the Cato Institute's political action will never manifest in reality for some reason. Now, that reason might be something like financial interests, but that might be distilled into an element. So now I'm going to bring up something I talked about last week, which is the idea that Popular Liberty on YouTube and a podcast talks about called archetropism. And I don't necessarily think he's the most profound guy sometimes, but he is attempting to distill things in a way that is more easy to reckon with in real life. And one of the things he says is the economic value of power is subjective. There's a time preference for power, the conversion of financial power into political power. So it's this idea that being in power does reap certain financial rewards or maybe even strategic rewards, right? So you can imagine you can imagine that a city in the United States secedes, but it operates on like a very important port or something of the sort. So because it's on this port, it's actually really valuable for the U.S., so it's really in the U.S.'s interest to like definitely keep that port and not let the private owners lock that port down and maybe like bilaterally negotiate with the U.S. Like the U.S. is like, no, the economic value of this very small region is actually very high, which means we are willing to exert a lot more political power in order to maintain that economic dominance. Now, if any random group seceded from the U.S. tomorrow, it might not be that they're on a specific like resource mine. It might not be because they're on a land that's valuable. It might just mean there is an economic value of the U.S. reinforcing to the whole U.S. that you can't secede, right? So like all of these elements have a political power and economic power or a value that is political and economic that is not necessarily arbitrary. It's not that they overtake these things for no reason. It's that there's like a strategic, political, and economic reason, right? So this is just the law isn't, oh, we know exactly when we'll invade and when we won't invade. The simple law is this value is subjective and needs to be taken into account. So when the Cato Institute talks about the Jones Act, they don't talk about how they're going to convince the people to stop supporting the Jones Act. They just say, here's why the Jones Act is bad. Obviously, that's not convincing enough given the political, economic, and strategic efforts of having the Jones Act in place. That's why they're operating in an ideological way that is ignorant of real politics. So this is like, although it's not fun to talk about this because it's clearly very relative and you have to figure out the motivations behind the actions, this is something that is like absolutely crucial. It's not particularly profound, but it isn't actually reckoned with in practice by ideological parties. And that's why the Libertarian Party, I would say, shoots itself in the foot by not just being a caucus of maybe the GOP, where they might have strategic pressures or something like that. Like, this goes back to the political strategy episode, but it's reckoning with these things have a subjective value. You need to acknowledge it.
So, I mean, I guess you can course correct if I'm going in an unhelpful direction. But when I think about values or morality or ethics, whatever phrase you want to use there, I mean, I think I've become less interested in those conversations. But at the same time, I acknowledge that for whatever reason, people feel like those are the most important conversations, and they operate based on ethics, morality, values. So this is why I was saying earlier that I think I agree more with Kohei now than I did when we first had our conversation with him, because, and I was trying to express this in the last episode when I was talking about values in terms of when I was talking about values technocrats had. I wasn't even like, because I wasn't even talking about values in like, a positive sense, like, oh, this person's a good person because they have values. No, I was saying values are, the stories people tell themselves. Values are the what they consider to be right or wrong, good or bad, and everybody sort of consciously or unconsciously, I think. Actually, let me rephrase that. I think you can boil down, or you can think about human relations in terms of power. I think when Foucault talks about this, I used to be like not sympathetic to that, because I used to think it kind of invalidated moral claims. But Foucault is not even like, he's not taking like a moral stance. He's not saying power's good, power's bad. He's just saying this is how people operate. This is how universities operate. This is how governments operate. This is how businesses operate. This is how you operate with your friends and your family and strangers. There are like, all these interconnected power dynamics that are going on, parents and children. That's another example. And you just kind of have to, it pays to accept that. It pays to acknowledge that, well, maybe if you're like, a member of the Republican Party, maybe, what ultimately drives you is not the values of the Republican Party. Maybe the Republican Party is your post hoc rationalization for, a phrase people will be very familiar with if they read Nietzsche, but maybe the person who's a registered Republican, they are enacting their will to power. They are enacting their desire to have an influence or dominate or control through values. That is really, I think, what a lot of moral conversations are. Is to quote my mortal enemy Jordan Peterson again, it can primate dominance hierarchies, and even if you're like watching a philosophy seminar with people debating whether consequentialist or deontological morality is the better morality, it's like there's that surface level conversation, but then there's the primate dominance hierarchy games. Ooh, can I win an argument? Can I win a debate? Can I prove myself superior intellectually, or can I prove that I'm a better scholar than this other person? And so this is why I think I've become less interested in moral conversations, and I've emphasized morality less when I think about politics. And this is also why I was like a while back, or I was thinking about this when we did our very first Michael Malice episode on moralism in politics, I think it was called. That was sort of like the seed that conversation was the seed for, the ideas that I'm harvesting now. Maybe a moralistic framework of thinking about politics or history is not a good way to think about it, because it's only at the surface level. It's assuming that people are fundamentally rational, if I may use a buzzword. It assumes that people are driven by ideas when they probably aren't.
I think I'm with you on a lot of that. So what you identified there is it's two tracks, right? And this is something that I've been seeing a lot in real life when I interact with people. But there's so you laid it as the moral track, right? To some extent, maybe I'm putting that word on it, and then the primate, dominance, hierarchy type track. So like you have the power, you have the morals. So a lot of work, it's not obvious that they're operating in different spheres, and people respond over them, which I think is one of the main reasons why nobody communicates effectively in political discourse. And then you add in like all the other even less useful things like ad hominem attacks, or just people consistently saying like non sequitur arguments that are just gibberish. So once you add all that in, then no wonder nobody can communicate, because it's all noise. You have people who are talking about what happens in practice in the real world. You're talking about people making moral claims, and then you're having people just like use weird, personal attacks. There isn't productive communication there. I've found this very frustrating for I think a similar reason you have, because so if you guys if anybody follows me on Twitter or finds me on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck, I go on Twitter Spaces a lot. It's fun. It's a lot of people. So pretty much if you follow somebody and they go into like a Twitter Spaces, it's like a chat room, and you can talk with other people, and you can or listen in while other people have conversations. It's fun. It's easy for me to jump in a conversation and hear people generally talking about like either Bitcoin or certain things about the news of the day. The issue is it's easy to walk into an echo chamber in terms of moral intuitions. So a lot of the conversations are frustrating because you have this urge of, I want to know what to do. I want to know what we should do. I want praxis. Like I want action to take. And everybody is really just having conversations about their moral intuitions and then high-fiving each other. And it's like, it's great. You feel very included when people are sharing your moral intuitions. It's very validating, especially if you have niche moral intuitions like I do. But I don't want to mistake that for, giving me advice for action to take in my life. Like sometimes the conversations go there. Sometimes I try to steer the conversations there. And there are people I've talked to who are very interesting on what is the way forward. But it's easy for people to just kind of play in the sandbox that is, moral intuition high-fiving, because you've come to your moral conclusions, you find the other ones unsatisfactory, you've done the thinking, and now you can congratulate yourselves and find the other people who now agree, who already agree with you, and then congratulate yourselves. And then it's also just like, it feels good to identify an enemy that has the opposite values. But as the whole Kohei episode proves, I think the reason at the time I was so against what he was saying is because it's like, well, I do have these moral intuitions I find valid, so don't tell me they don't matter. And it's like, well, they don't matter in this other sphere. And at this point, I'm willing to recognize, like, yeah, Kohei was saying something valuable in the sense that this other sphere exists, right? And we do need to operate in that other sphere. Yeah. So I'm with you. I don't know if I lost the train of thought of where to bounce off from that, or if you want to add something on. Do you have a similar rabbit hole, or want to expand a little bit? Because I feel like we're agreeing, which is good.
I guess here's a rabbit hole maybe we could explore a little bit. I think I'm still as often my thought process or my views are in flux, and I think I'm still like kind of debating with myself and others how useful the sphere of morality is or is not. So, because as you say, I guess if we think about it from, or as I was saying, I do think a lot of morality, or a lot of what passes for morality, is sort of gibberish that people put onto their actions in order to feel better about their actions, in order to persuade other people that those actions are fine or good. It reminds me of the nature of language. I was listening to a podcast not too long ago. It's some doctor runs this podcast. I don't even remember the name of it, but he was interviewing, I think, a physicist, and the physicist said something that stuck with me. He said, language was not probably didn't evolve. Not probably. Language didn't evolve to come to some sort of truth. Knowledge wasn't language wasn't designed to for knowledge or truth. Language was a social was designed to persuade the other members of your social group, like, hey, we shouldn't go that direction because there's a tiger in that direction, and if we go in that direction, a couple of us are going to get mauled by tigers, and that's going to be bad. So that goes off what you were saying earlier about the why it's hard to talk about political matters, and why political discourse can be so unhelpful and toxic, because the tools we're operating with, and we can't operate with any other tools, but the tools we're operating with aren't necessarily designed for what we're trying to use them for. And that's probably a good segue, actually, for to tie it back to morality. How useful is morality, even in the confines of that social sphere? And I guess I'm more agnostic about it at the moment. I don't really, I haven't really decided one way or the other. As I said earlier, I'm more critical of people who make moral arguments than I used to be. But at the same time, I'm not sure I can escape moral arguments entirely. So I don't know if we really want to go down that rabbit hole or not, but that's sort of a thought I was having. I thought I've been having, and you reminded me of.
Yeah. So I guess I would say that policy or action is a combination of what you can do, but then you need to know what direction you want to work for. So I'm under so one thing that drew me to maybe talk about this is there are people, and this isn't supposed to be said as an absolute this isn't meant to be an absolute statement, because I think if you and I sat down and we tried to distill what rules happen, and this isn't the goal of the episode, isn't to distill what these natural laws are that don't work when they don't get broken. But if I was going to list things that I expect to be rules like that, I would expect them to cut against certain views. So, and even things I'm in favor of. I mean, the reason why the Libertarian Party isn't the dominant party in the United States, in my estimation, would probably have to do with a lot of these political and social rules that I think also permeate. So when I think of what policies need to get put forward, you need a direction to aim at, you need a trajectory to work towards, and then you need to make sure you're not violating certain rules. So if you think there's a certain direction to work for, but you know that putting the policy in play that works in that direction actually either doesn't do what you'd expect it to do or hope it would do, or it actually undercuts your future power, which means you can't do more of that, and then somebody will take the power and take it the opposite degree, then you're like, well, even though you've picked the direction, you've now violated these rules, so it's not going to work. So I think to the degree that moral discussions are helpful, you need something to point you in the correct direction, right? So there are certain things that sound less morality driven than they are, like saying vague things about well-being. So a lot of people who dodge certain big moral questions that consider themselves intellectuals in the public intellectual sphere, I feel like Michael Shermer, he's a person who I generally don't like most of his takes on, so I feel like he might do this. But yeah, this is just an ad hominem on Michael Shermer because I feel like it. He might say something along the lines of, I'm not making a moral claim, I'm focusing on well-being, to whatever he thinks well-being, what well-being means. And that might be lower poverty or more happiness. Well, I would say that's still a moral claim, and that's okay. Michael Shermer has evaluated moral claims. He just chooses to give them some sort of non-moral baggage attached to it, and then say, this is the direction I think public policy should point in. And I'm okay with that. That's where I think moral arguments lie. So like my moral arguments point me in the direction of I need to minimize government to the degree that I can get away from that we can get away from it. That doesn't mean proposing that we destroy the government tomorrow, because that's so unpolitically palatable that it won't do that, right? It's impossible to enact because it's not palatable. So you need to work with the circumstances that are given. But although I think it's really hard to argue and suss out morality arguments because they're so intuition based, I do think you need to have them because they help your compass, right? So like, even if you say you're skeptical, Matt, of moral claims, I know that you're still in favor of a lot of like pro universal healthcare type policies. So it's like, okay, well, you're not for that for no reason. You're for that because you think that there's like everybody should be covered in some way, right? So it's like that doesn't come from nowhere. You need that compass. And I'm okay with accepting that is the utility of it. And it doesn't necessarily tell you anymore, but that's okay. This is an integral element.
I mean, I guess all I could say in the moment is I'll have to think more about your take, process it more, give it more scrutiny in my head before I really have a good response to it. Because, as I said, I guess I worry that people are going to, use moral claims to either make erroneous judgments about, human conduct or history, or they're going to like forget that everything does boil down to power. And they're going to forget certain historical rules, or they're going to forget maybe certain truisms or that we can test or we can verify with data. I don't want us to get bogged down in really the nitty gritty of moral claims fundamentally. It's fun to have those, maybe conversations. We're both podcasters, so you could pick a moral claim and we could rant about it for an hour, and that's fine, and it's all fun and dandy. And I like philosophy. I like debating ideas, but I don't want us to fall into the trap that most intellectuals fall into, which is to assume the supremacy of ideas, or assume that ideas are what matter the most, or assume that the average person is focused on ideas. This is why I'm like, one aspect of like Karl Marx's thought that I do appreciate is his historical materialist approach. His argument is this, that human history, first and foremost, is based on material conditions. So what are the material interests of various groups throughout history? And, Marx thought that, well, people are going to act based on those material interests. Now, maybe they'll act in ways that actually will end up hurting their material interest. But I guess if you're going to put on your economist hat, you'll make some argument about, well, okay, people are at least going to try to do something rational, even if it blows up in their face. So that's a really fun. That's a great breakthrough in our thinking of history. It's not really the ideas that are springing forth material conditions. It's really the material conditions that are springing where the ideas are springing forth or coming from. So I guess what I'm advocating for is a more for lack of a better phrase, like scientific approach to thinking about humans, or maybe I could to put it another way. Remember the fact that we're animals first and foremost, and we have animal needs, and we're not these we're not angels, we're not gods. We're pretty limited creatures, if I don't say so myself, and that will both put limits on our achievements, but it also will cause our achievements to go in, and our actions to go in certain directions. And I think moral claims often forget about that. And my issue with like a lot of a lot of moral claims that spring from religion is they don't take into account the fact that you're like, an animal with certain needs and desires and emotions. So it's like the prohibition on sex in among, say, priests in the Catholic Church. Like that's an absurdity, and the reason it's an absurdity is because it's denying the animal nature, and it's denying the fact that priests are sexual beings, and it doesn't take into account the fact that their sexual energy is probably going to get come out in hypocritical and or harmful ways. So that's really my long spiel criticizing morality. The rest of the stuff you mentioned, I'll respond to at a later date.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I was kind of able to map what you were saying and see how that interacts with what I was saying. So I was kind of like drawing a compass, right? And I'm saying this is what morality is for, and then the compass is policy direction. But the reason you're critical is you're saying like morality, though, like why is that the compass? Given that if I was going to summarize what you're saying, and I'll give it more meat on the bones, so maybe you don't hate that I summarize it this way. But morality isn't necessarily authentic, even though we perceive it as authentic. A lot of times the post hoc rationalization, a lot of times it's from our culture. Marx says it could be from our materialist condition. Sometimes it's like, and then we also give it this absolutist framing. We end up giving it this absolutist framing, even if it is likely kind of arbitrary or it's up for interpretation. So all of our intuitions are, this is the most authentic thing about me. Yet, if you survey people, you can find these trends that overlap. And then we're like, hey, I don't know if this should be given this high regard as it does. Maybe one of the reasons why in the moment I'm not necessarily sold on what to do about that is just this idea of, I don't know what else to use. And just because maybe we don't know how the proportions lay out. So I guess I would say a lot of people are very confident about a lot of things they know nothing about. I'm sure you and I fall into this very often. I'd like to think that you and I are more educated than a lot of people, but a lot of people don't know a lot on things they talk about, and this happens all the time. Because of that, this obviously impacts the political sphere and the moral sphere. And a lot of times people derive these things in arbitrary ways. So I think I acknowledge what you're saying is true. I just don't know how to act otherwise, right? So in the end, I think that's a solid job of poisoning the well of morality that I don't think is incorrect. But on the other hand, it's like, well, what should I use as the compass instead? Because I do still think I can defend the ideas I believe in, and I do still think they're worthwhile, even if that is a fairly good contaminant. Because in the end, as you started the episode by mentioning Slavoj Žižek, everything's ideological in the sense that it has a worldview and moral baggage associated with it. So it's like, can I escape this compass? Is the only compass we have a flawed one? And that is something interesting. I'll let you get a word in, but I think we're going to need to wrap
up. So I guess maybe what I would say is, I do think there are certain. Okay, so if you're, if you have an, intelligence quotient of like 70 or above, you probably heard the term social construct. You probably know what that means, right? People talk about all kinds of things being social constructs. And I guess to build off what you said, just because something is a social construct doesn't necessarily mean you can get away from it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's incorrect. But I guess I would just, recommend people, acknowledge something's a social construct and say, but we can't escape it. So, and it might still bring you meaning or value or purpose. And so that's fine. But in the back of your mind, just, keep in mind that this is not like a ordained by God. This is not a fundamental law of the universe. It's just kind of the way humans' brains are constructed or the way human relations work. So I guess that's sort of my thought process around it, and that might be same for morality. I don't know, but yeah.
Got it. And I think that all jives with everything we've been saying the whole episode, right? So it's like that is the perk of maybe distilling certain fundamental, like, natural elements of what happens anyways, because even if we have this tool that could be useful, that is maybe flawed, but we can maybe work past it. In the end, the things that do dictate a lot of policy and a lot of traps we consistently fall into are things that are just true regardless of how we feel about them. And those things might be like fragility, anti-fragility, laws of power, right? And those are things that there is not an emphasis on, probably for nefarious reasons, I would say. Because, we've talked about the neoliberal elite, right? And we talked about globalists that use systems to reinforce their power. And frankly, the idea that we're talking about the foggy moral territory instead of talking about, wait, when do these things work out better or not, is maybe a more productive way of working. But that also might go to another law, which I would say maybe a lot of people who are powerful want to maintain their fat power, and they'll do things to maintain their power. Like this is the law. So maybe how it is unproductive in discourse, but maybe that's also one of the rules that we have to cope with, and that's okay. So are you okay with me wrapping up? And okay. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know that was very freewheeling, but I think we did cover territory I've been wanting to cover for a while, and that clarified some thoughts I've been wanting to work through in a way that I'm actually very satisfied with. A lot of times we devolve into giving a okay version of the arguments lingering in our heads, and we're somewhat satisfied. But this was actually exploratory in a productive way, and I jotted down a lot of things as we were going through, so I'm happy with it. You can find more of my content on Twitter at Matthew T. Keck, where every now and then I complain about coronavirus related stuff and people's bad takes. And sometimes I point expletives in the direction of government officials in my local jurisdictions. You can find other content I've done in the past that I always want to revisit and maybe delve more into at the Obey podcast. And you can find that on any podcast feed as well. You can find our content on YouTube or any podcatcher beyond Talking Points. You can find Matt's Twitter at Matthew Hazel Woe, so WO and then an 8. So you can, if you're on YouTube, you can see his name on the screen. You just take the OD at the end of Matthew Hazelwood and put an 8 there. That's his Twitter handle. And he puts YouTube videos out under the Anti-Philosopher, where he does vlogs, and he also does his other podcast, Philosopher's Guide to the Apocalypse. I almost forgot halfway through what it was. You can find that on any podcatcher as well. And I'd also say that Matt is going to be on Keegan's podcast and YouTube channel in the near future. So Keegan is Essential Salts on YouTube, and he hosts the Nietzsche podcast. Yeah, it's the Nietzsche podcast. I know that. It's a very creative title. So I think that's all the plugs off the top of my head. If you guys enjoyed this episode, feel free to check out our backlog. I know during the episode, Matt name dropped a few episodes where we've talked about it in the past, so you can find more on similar topics and all sorts of other things that are evergreen. But for now, sign off is Matt. Thank you.